Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute sheer scale of global business. When a company decides to cross borders, it is not just about, selling more products. It becomes this incredibly complex web of strategy, immense risk, and, crucially, the hidden micro-level operational steps that are absolutely required to keep the entire machine ethical and actually functioning.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our agenda today: 1. Domestic versus global business. 2. Catalysts for global expansion. 3. The Apple supply chain crisis. 4. The cost of exploitation. And 5. Rebuilding through operational control.
Section 1, Domestic versus Global Business. To start off, we really have to set the baseline here, contrasting the relative safety of a localized business environment with the wild complexities of crossing international borders. 38,000. That's a massive number, right? That is actually the number of restaurants McDonald's operates in more than 120 countries. When you put that side by side with your local mom-and-pop shop, the sheer scale of international operations is just insane. Yet, strangely enough, you can buy a Big Mac basically anywhere on Earth, and it tastes exactly the same. So how in the world do they maintain that kind of consistency across such a vast footprint? Well, it comes down to understanding the operational theater. Consider a domestic business like Kroger, which operates strictly inside the United States, or something like the American Red Cross. Their day-to-day operations and their economic impacts remain entirely within a specific country's borders. They are governed purely by local and national laws. But contrast that with the international environment. Global giants have to constantly adapt to diverse cultural expectations, and they're governed by massive international entities like the World Trade Organization for trade rules or the International Monetary Fund for monetary equality. It is a whole different ballgame. Moving to Section 2, Catalysts for Global Expansion. It begs the question, if the international theater is so heavily regulated and so unbelievably complex, why do companies take on the immense risk of going global in the first place? There is a massive allure to global expansion, and it's generally driven by 4 main catalysts. First up is revenue and profitability. You are essentially unlocking entirely new revenue streams through market diversification. Second is competitive advantage. Going global grants you access to much broader talent pools and economies of scale, which lets you produce products at significantly lower costs. Third is risk management. By branching out, you aren't putting all your eggs in one basket. You reduce your dependence on a single market, which builds resilience against localized economic downturns. And fourth, broader brand recognition across entirely different cultures. Mastering these 4 catalysts, that is the absolute bedrock of unprecedented business success and profitability. But here is the critical question we have to ask ourselves. What happens when that relentless drive for profit and rapid expansion outpaces a company's ethics? When expansion happens without those crucial safeguards in place, it almost always leads to total disaster. So to expand responsibly, global operations first have to pass through 3 very specific ethical filters. Filter 1 is environmental sustainability, ensuring the company leaves the smallest possible ecological footprint. Filter 2 focuses on human and labor rights, meaning the company takes direct responsibility for its supply chain performance and worker conditions. And Filter 3 is cultural sensitivity. This means actively respecting local communities and deeply studying cultural differences to ease the transition. Basically, a company has to be as transparent as allowable and leave as small a negative impact on their new community as humanly possible. Section 3, the Apple supply chain crisis. Let's zoom in on a central, real-world case study to see what actually goes down when those ethical filters completely fail. Let's trace the direct domino effect of corporate strategy here. Apple's internal pricing policies and incredibly intense demands created extreme margin and timeline pressures. Naturally, all that pressure fell directly onto their global suppliers, specifically companies like Foxconn and Pegatron. And to meet those massive corporate demands, those suppliers resorted to severe ethical shortcuts. And the reality of those shortcuts was incredibly sobering. Starting around 2010, undercover investigations revealed some truly harrowing human rights violations at these overseas facilities. We are talking about excessive work hours, instances of child labor, severe environmental pollution, and, tragically, a highly publicized wave of worker suicides. Now, as a socially responsible entity, Apple was held partially responsible by the global community simply because of its continued association with these companies. Which brings us to Section 4, the cost of exploitation. Let's analyze the actual financial and reputational fallout. What is the real cost to a business when its overseas suppliers engage in exploitation? Ultimately, a company faces 2 distinct paths. First is the vicious cycle. Poor employee treatment leads to high absenteeism, increased turnover, constantly having to pay for retraining, and ultimately catastrophic brand damage in the global media. Contrast that with the virtuous cycle, which is, frankly, the true driver of modern business success. Fair treatment generates employee happiness, which drives higher productivity, eliminates all those replacement training costs, and secures essential brand trust. So the crucial point is that in the modern global market, public opinion can literally make or break a business. There's a quote that hits the nail on the head. Apple's brand equity relies entirely on supply chain transparency. Apple was lambasted globally because they had explicitly promised fair practice. The takeaway here is that a company simply cannot separate itself from its suppliers anymore. They have to own their suppliers' actions as if they were their own. Section 5. Rebuilding through operational control. Let's shift gears from the problem to the solution. How does a massive corporation actually go about fixing a broken global supply chain? To repair the immense damage, Apple had to initiate some very critical interventions. First, active supplier conferencing and transparency, meaning their supply chain managers had to directly engage with each and every supplier. Second, they had to reform on-the-ground conditions, directly helping suppliers improve employees' personal living and working environments. And third, crucially, internal policy reparations. Apple actually had to adjust its own pricing policies to soften the extreme financial pressures that originally forced those suppliers into unfair labor practices in the first place. But making policies in a boardroom just isn't enough. Sure, global strategy dictates what we do, and corporate ethics dictate why we do it. But to actually enforce those ethical standards across thousands of miles, organizations have to abandon those high-level macro theories and adopt highly granular, micro-level operational methodologies. Essentially, you have to map out the entire process step by step. To really understand process mapping, let's think about a relatable everyday analogy. The anatomy of operational logic utilizes what we call decision gates and specific action steps. It sounds incredibly complex when applied to global supply chains, but at its core, it utilizes the exact same binary logic as deciding whether to feed a hungry dog. Is the dog hungry? Yes or no? If yes, get the food, put the food in the bowl, and so on. Enforcing global efficiency and ethical compliance relies entirely on standardizing these simple, binary, physical tasks across the whole chain. One major methodology used to control these processes is lean manufacturing, which is defined by the systematic, relentless elimination of waste. Long-term business success requires stripping away 8 specific types of waste, and they are perfectly captured by the acronym downtime. You've got defects that harm your reputation, overproduction, making things just in case instead of just in time, waiting for halted production lines, non-utilized talent on the floor, unnecessary transportation, poor inventory management, inefficient motion of workers, and extra processing steps that just don't add any value to the final product. Working right alongside Lean is Six Sigma, which is a totally distinct methodology aimed at aggressively reducing defects and enforcing unyielding consistency. It operates on what's called the DMAIC loop. First, define the specific problem. Second, measure the current baseline performance. Third, analyze the root cause of the defects, kind of like finding out about Apple's pricing pressure. Fourth, improve the situation by implementing a solution. And finally, control the process to maintain that solution and guarantee long-term operational consistency. Mastering these controls is exactly what separates a highly vulnerable company from one with enduring business success. When you bring all these concepts together into a unified global operation, a very clear hierarchy emerges. Think of it like a pyramid. Global expansion and scale are the peak. That's accessing new markets and gaining brand recognition. Protecting that peak, wrapped around it, are your corporate social responsibility and ethical guardrails. But holding the whole thing up, that is a solid foundation of Lean, Six Sigma, and process mapping. These unyielding, granular operational systems are what actually makes sustainable scale possible. You simply cannot have the top of the pyramid without that structural foundation at the bottom. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to take away from this explainer. Can a corporation truly enforce ethics across thousands of miles without rigorous process control? Well, the evidence strongly suggests they cannot. Macro business ethics and micro operational efficiency are completely, unavoidably inseparable. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep exploring the fascinating mechanics behind the businesses that shape our world.